For our first session today at the 5G Manufacturing Forum, it is a pleasure to introduce Mr. Leo Gergs, Senior Analyst with ABI Research, to discuss the 5G timeline. So Leo, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sean, for that kind introduction, and good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, everyone, depending from where you're dialing into today. It's a pleasure to be able to open and introduce this 5G Manufacturing Forum with a brief keynote. So thank you very much for the RCR team to pull all this together. What I want to do in this keynote is look at the 5G timeline, if you want to say so, and dig into the promises and look at the reality and how 5G has delivered on those promises and where more needs to happen. So what we're gonna do is I'll start with a look where we are now, looking or examining market growth and maturity, then briefly dive into who is doing what with spectrum, look at recent 5G deployments for manufacturing enterprises, and then close with looking at trends and market predictions, and a brief set of recommendations, really. Now, if we look at where we are now, we see that the private networks domain in general is about to advance rapidly, and gaining more and more market traction towards the end of the decade, with a critical inflection point in 2026, 2027, 2028. Now, manufacturing, as you can see, is one of the key verticals in this equation, and we, according to our research, by 2030 will make up 23% of private network revenues overall, which accounts for roughly $15 billion. Now, what are the key drivers for this? Is firstly, you have a high degree of mission critical or even life critical use cases if you look at a factory floor, for example, and an environment that's very unfriendly, if you want to say it like that, to wireless connectivity. So strength, reliability, and availability of networking becomes important. And that's where cellular connectivity, and specifically 5G with deterministic networking and time-sensitive networking, becomes a very important factor there. Now, other technology and business drivers are looking at increased demand of connectivity and digitization from end verticals like manufacturing in the wake of Industry 4.0, for example, which requires the whole digitization of all production assets, really, as well as a paradigm shift of spectrum usage towards enterprise or liberalizing spectrum for enterprise usage, really. The value proposition here is that 5G as I said, with TSN and deterministic networking can really provide the necessary means for to enhance the performance of OT, IT, and communication tools for increased productivity. So, having said that, let's look at maturity. And to do this, I want to draw your attention towards the voice of the manufacturers, actually. And this is from a study that we have done together with Nokia in the beginning of 2020, asking 528 manufacturers across consumer manufacturing, industrial manufacturing, and automotive manufacturing about the main inhibitors to deploy private networks. And as you can see, there are two factors at play that inhibits them. One is an ecosystem immaturity, and the second one is a technology immaturity. As you can see, most of the respondents have argued about the lack of 4G and 5G capable devices and supporting ecosystem, lack of finalized standards, as well as availability of spectrum to enterprises without having to go through network operators. Now, even though standards have somewhat been finalized with 3GPP having frozen release 16 earlier on already, this still hasn't trickled down into the device ecosystem. So no release 16 capable devices for industrial usage are available. So device ecosystem is becoming even more important. But on top of that, there's also a technology immaturity stemming from the fact that 5G as it stands, or as it has been, at least as it has been communicated to manufacturers, seems to not support existing industrial communication protocols like Profinet and other field bus communication or applications. Now, there are first tentative signs to resolve this. For example, the German VDMA has released a study together with the Fraunhofer Institute on how release 16 5G will be able to address most of the existing field bus communication. And also you have first tentative signs of collaboration on that domain, with the 5G ACIA, for example, having signed a memorandum of understanding with the OPC-UA. But still, these are only very tentative first steps, and a lot of more has to happen there to resolve that technology immaturity, really. Now, let's look at spectrum then. And as you can see here, spectrum liberalization initiatives are on the rise. So to say, some kind of initiatives that give enterprises access to spectrum or allow enterprises access to spectrum without necessary operator involvement. However, what you can see here is that the landscape is between shared spectrum and licensed spectrum specifically is very, very fragmented. While the US, for example, has a very strong stand on shared spectrum with CBRS, and the UK has followed that approach. Other European countries and to some extent Asian countries are following, look at the licensing or setting aside licensed spectrum for enterprises. And even more important, within this setting aside spectrum, you're looking at a huge degree of fragmentation when it comes to which spectrum bands and proportions of spectrum bands are set aside, which makes it more and more difficult for enterprises, for example, to connect different sites from different continents with each other. So even though there's a lot of movement happening there, the lack of globally harmonized spectrum is still an important inhibitor for, say, a large manufacturer to deploy 5G on their factory floor if they have multiple manufacturing locations across the globe. Now, looking at recent 5G deployments for manufacturing enterprises, sorry about that, I listed, or I looked for some of the newer announcements that haven't been discussed in the industry as much. And while this has been somewhat of a difficult task, to be honest, because fully commercial enterprise or manufacturing deployments are not happening at a large scale at the moment. And that's why I'd also include the test beds in here, because what we're seeing, and we've done an analysis on all the private network announcements that have happened until today, is that it's still largely driven by R&D initiatives and proof of concept deployments, trial deployments. Factories or manufacturers looking at what's possible with 5G or with enterprise 5G. What can we do with that? Furthermore, we've looked at the licensees of private spectrum in Germany, and most of them are funded, most of these initiatives are funded through R&D projects funded by the federal government. Now, that's an important point, actually, because we see the focus of R&D projects slowly but surely shifting towards 6G and enterprise capabilities for 6G. So, for example, in Germany, there will only be a couple of new research projects funded for enterprise 5G next year. And with that shift in mind, the risk of an investment gap into enterprise 5G will grow and become more and more realistic. So a lot of decoupling from research has to happen to drive and advance 5G in the enterprise domain and manufacturing domain. Now let's briefly look into the future then, and specifically look at the factory of the future. We see that even today, the predominant way of connecting machines and production assets with each other is through fixed line connectivity. But by as you can see, the amount or the proportion of wireless connectivity is rising. For main drivers are flexibility, driving down maintenance costs, and also machine downtime, right? However, as you can also see in this graph, is that 4G and 5G, so cellular connections, will make up only 7% of wireless connections by 2030. Now, this is not to say, or this is not to give a downbeat picture of 5G, of cellular in the manufacturing domain, but rather it gives you a realistic picture of the degree of technology fragmentation that will prevail on the factory floor. So in order for 4G and 5 and ultimately 5G to be successful for manufacturers and be interesting for manufacturers, any private 5G solution or private 5G platform needs to ensure perfect interoperability with all the legacy technologies, be it Wi-Fi, be it Bluetooth to some extent, or even some Ethernet-based connectivity solutions that will still prevail on the factory floor. And with that, I would like to conclude my part of the presentation. And if we have, I see we have a couple of minutes remaining. So if there are any questions, I am happy to address them.
Thank you for that presentation, Leo. I think we do have time for one question, and maybe you could expound on your comment there at the end around technological fragmentation and the percentage of 4G, 5G connections that we'll see over the next 9 years. What does that mean in terms of the ecosystem that's going to support 5G implementations in manufacturing environments?
Well, I think so. You have to bear in mind that this picture is drawn with the current ecosystem or with the current advancements of the ecosystem in mind. So I think a very important limiting factor of this picture is that devices are just not available at the moment, and we don't really see the advancement happening at a pace that would be necessary for manufacturers to start jumping on that train and realize, oh, 5G is actually what we can meaningfully deploy. Now, if the device, I think this should really be a call to chipset manufacturers, network equipment vendors, infrastructure vendors, really, to say, if the device ecosystem advances and if devices become available more and more quickly than everyone anticipates at this point, which I think is not hard, then this number will certainly has the potential to grow, right? But it becomes a question of how fast the ecosystem or how fast devices actually become available. So I think there is a correlation, and I think that the availability of devices is a key enabler for this proportion to rise, not the other way around.
All right, Leo. Well, we really appreciate your perspective, and we'll end it there. But again, we really enjoyed getting your perspective on this topic. So thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.